Her day began with purpose, a quiet drive through Georgia's warmth. But a false accusation and a badge twisted her reality. What happened next would expose an entire system, when the very next day she became their judge.
The rhythmic drone of the interstate was a familiar lullaby, a steady thrum against the tires as Nadine Russell steered her sleek sedan south of Atlanta. For Judge Russell, a seasoned state judge in her mid-50s, these drives were a rare solace. They offered moments of quiet before the storm of dockets, the intricate dance of legal arguments, and the profound weight of decisions that shaped lives. Today was no different. She was en route to a high-level judicial reform summit, a gathering of minds dedicated to chiseling away at the imperfections of the justice system she so fiercely believed in. Her mind drifted, a gentle current through the legal precedents she'd reviewed, the subtle biases she constantly fought to identify, both in others and in quieter moments in herself. Justice wasn't a static ideal. It was a living, breathing, often flawed entity that required constant nurturing, constant reform. It was a lifelong commitment, etched into her very being. She glanced at the passing landscape, the lush green of Georgia giving way to the sprawling outskirts of towns that held their own complex histories. Every mile was a reminder of the ground she'd covered, both personally and professionally. From humble beginnings, Nadine had ascended to the bench, a testament to intellect, perseverance, and an unwavering moral compass. She carried that journey with her, not as a burden, but as a quiet source of strength, a wellspring of dignity that defined her presence in every courtroom she commanded. A quick check of the dashboard clock told her it was time for a brief stop. The summit's agenda was packed, and a few minutes to stretch her legs and confirm the exact directions wouldn't hurt. She spotted a familiar blue sign indicating a highway rest stop just ahead. It was a routine decision, one Nadine had made countless times. The sun, high in the afternoon sky, cast long shadows as she guided her car into an empty spot, the engine settling into a soft purr. Nadine pulled out her phone, its screen a small window to the GPS map, tracing the final leg of her journey. The air was calm, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant traffic. There was no premonition, no shiver down her spine, just the quiet focus of a professional woman dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, preparing for the next step of her important day. The world around her was ordinary, unsuspecting, utterly unaware of the profound shift that was about to occur. She stretched, a small sigh escaping her lips, ready to get back on the road, certainly not prepared for the silent, almost imperceptible shift in the environment that announced the presence of an unexpected shadow. The digital map on Nadine's phone, a beacon guiding her journey, suddenly seemed to dim as two figures entered her peripheral vision. Two sheriff's deputies, their uniforms crisp against the afternoon sun, approached her parked car. Their movements were measured, a controlled stride that bespoke authority. One took a position near her driver's side, while the other lingered slightly behind, his hand casually, yet deliberately, near his belt. The ordinary hum of the rest stop gave way to a sharp internal prickle of awareness for Nadine. This felt different. The lead deputy, his face impassive, leaned slightly. "Ma'am?" His voice was flat, carrying an impersonal authority that grated on the ears. "We're investigating a stolen vehicle reported in this vicinity. Your car matches the description." A mistake. The thought was instantaneous, a quiet certainty within Nadine's mind. Her vehicle, while a common model, was well-maintained, unassuming, and certainly not a match for any stolen vehicle she could conceive. She met his gaze, calm and steady, drawing on the reserves of composure she had cultivated over a lifetime on the bench. "Officer," she replied, her voice clear, resonating with the quiet power of someone accustomed to being heard. "I believe there's been an error. This is my personal vehicle, registered to me. I am Judge Nadine Russell, and I am currently en route to a judicial reform summit." Nadine observed them closely, scanning for the flicker of recognition, the subtle shift in posture that typically followed such an introduction. There was none, only a tightening around the lead deputy's eyes, a dismissive sweep of his gaze over her professional attire. His partner, previously unmoving, took a half-step forward, his attention seeming to dissect every inch of her car. The initial claim of a stolen vehicle felt less like a genuine inquiry and more like a flimsy pretext, a thin veil over an unstated purpose. The air around her car, once open and free, now felt confined, charged with an unspoken tension. Nadine, a guardian of the law, was being viewed not as a fellow professional, not as a respected citizen, but as a suspect. The simple act of checking directions had been hijacked, twisted into something colder, something rooted in a prejudice she understood all too well. The conversation, she realized with a deepening sense of unease, was no longer about a car. It was about something else entirely, something simmering just beneath the surface of their polite yet insistent words. The deputy's response was swift, a dismissive wave of his hand. "We're going to need to search your vehicle, ma'am, just to clear things up." His tone, while still outwardly professional, carried an undeniable edge of command, an expectation of compliance. Nadine felt the subtle pressure building, a familiar tactic designed to disarm and intimidate. But she was not easily intimidated. Decades in the courtroom had taught her the precise boundaries of authority, the lines that could not be crossed without due process. "Officer," Nadine stated, her voice remaining even, though a quiet steel had begun to underpin her words. "I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. You do not have probable cause for such an action." Her eyes held his, conveying not defiance, but an assertion of fundamental rights. She watched for a reaction, for any sign that the legal term probable cause would register, would trigger a recognition of her position, or at least a pause. Instead, his expression hardened further. His partner, who had been observing silently, took another step closer, his presence feeling more overtly threatening. "Ma'am, if you're not cooperating, that just makes things worse for you," the lead deputy said, his voice now tinged with a distinct warning. "We're just doing our job. If there's nothing to hide, there's no reason to object." The illogicality of his statement was glaring. "My objection is to an unlawful search," Nadine clarified, maintaining her calm, logical posture. "My rights do not depend on whether I have something to hide. They depend on the law." She saw a flicker of irritation cross the deputy's face, a hint of impatience with her steadfastness. It was the irritation of authority challenged, of an unspoken expectation of deference being denied. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," he said, his voice dropping slightly, now a clear threat. He glanced pointedly at his partner, then back at Nadine. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. "She's a black woman at a rest stop. Her legal arguments hold no weight here." The power dynamic had shifted completely, transforming from a supposed investigation into a blatant test of wills, where the law was not a shield, but a weapon. Nadine knew in that moment that her quiet assertion of legal boundaries had sealed her immediate fate. The lead deputy's words hung in the air, a final, chilling pronouncement. "That's obstruction, ma'am. You're under arrest." The shift was abrupt, almost brutal. Before Nadine could respond, before the full weight of the accusation could settle, he reached for her arm. His grip was surprisingly firm, cold, and impersonal. Her professional composure, a lifetime's practice, felt momentarily inadequate against the raw physical reality of his intent. She registered the glint of metal, the swift, practiced movement as his partner produced handcuffs. The cuffs clicked, cold and unforgiving, around her wrists. The sound, sharp and final, echoed in the quiet afternoon. Her hands, which typically held legal texts or wielded a gavel, were now bound behind her back, a grotesque inversion of her usual posture of authority. The sheer indignity of it washed over Nadine, a wave of profound shock momentarily eclipsing all other thoughts. Here, under the indifferent Georgia sky, her robes of office, her years of service, her very identity as Judge Nadine Russell, meant nothing. She was simply a black woman, deemed an immediate threat, now reduced to a suspect. The sun beat down, deceptively warm, as the deputy pulled her gently but firmly from the driver's seat. Her tailored suit felt suddenly confining, the material pulling awkwardly as she was maneuvered. Nadine felt a surge of indignation, a heat rising in her chest, but she kept her face impassive. Years of discipline, of mastering her emotions in the courtroom, now served a different purpose: to maintain her composure in the face of blatant injustice. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "This is unlawful," Nadine stated, her voice steady despite the tightness in her throat. "I have asserted my rights. You have no probable cause for this arrest." The words were for the record, for herself, even if they fell on deaf ears. The deputies exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance, a shared smirk that spoke volumes. Her legal arguments, her authority, were meaningless in their perception. They guided her towards the patrol car, the crunch of gravel under her shoes a harsh counterpoint to the quiet dignity she clung to. The back seat of a police cruiser was a place she usually saw from the other side of the courtroom. Now she was inside it, the confines feeling suffocating. The reality of her situation settled in, racially profiled, wrongfully accused, and utterly at their mercy. The injustice burned, a quiet fire, but her resolve, though tested, remained unyielding. This was not just an inconvenience, it was an assault on everything she stood for. The ride to the precinct was a blur of silence and simmering indignation. The world outside the tinted windows seemed to mock Nadine's predicament, ordinary life continuing, oblivious to the profound miscarriage of justice unfolding within the confines of the patrol car. Once at the rural station, she was led through a series of stark hallways, the fluorescent lights humming an indifferent tune. Every step was a fresh indignity, a further stripping away of her professional self. She was guided to a small, cold room, a holding cell. The scent of disinfectant and stale air hung heavy. The metal bench, hard and unyielding, offered no comfort as she was instructed to sit. Her hands, still cuffed behind her, felt clumsy, alien. Nadine kept her gaze steady, observing the intake officer with the same meticulous attention she'd give a witness on the stand. "I need to make a phone call," she stated, her voice clear, resonating with an authority that seemed to momentarily surprise the officer. "I need to contact my office. I'm an active state judge, Nadine Russell. My office needs to be informed of my location and the nature of this unlawful detention." The officer, a young man with a weary expression, merely shook his head. "Booking process first, ma'am. Everyone gets their call after they've been processed." His words were rote, devoid of genuine malice, but utterly dismissive of her status, her credentials, her very identity. It was a bureaucratic wall designed to strip away individual claims and reduce everyone to a number in a system. Nadine felt a familiar tightness in her chest. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a deliberate denial of a fundamental right, exacerbated by their refusal to acknowledge who she was. She repeated her name, her court, the urgency of her professional obligations. But her words seemed to vanish into the sterile air of the cell. They saw only the arrestee, the black woman brought in on an obstruction charge. The weight of their refusal to truly see her was almost as heavy as the cuffs. Hours blurred into an indistinguishable stretch of time. The cold concrete seeped into her bones, but her mind remained sharp, alert, though simmering with a quiet fury. She mentally reviewed the events, noting every procedural violation, every dismissive remark. Her dignity remained intact, a quiet defiance against the dehumanizing process. She was Nadine Russell, judge of the state court, and no flimsy charge or dismissive officer could strip that truth from her. She waited, a statue of composure in a cage of injustice, knowing that eventually the truth would demand its recognition. The hours stretched, punctuated only by the distant ring of phones and the occasional murmur of voices from the outer office. Nadine remained a sentinel of stillness on the cold bench, her internal clock ticking with a precise judicial rhythm. Her mind, though wearied by the injustice, stayed sharp, observing the minute shifts in the station's atmosphere, the changing light from the small barred window. She knew this waiting game, this psychological pressure, was part of the process designed to break spirits. But her spirit, forged in fire and tempered by truth, was not so easily fractured. Then the door to the holding area opened, and a new presence entered. A man in a crisper uniform bearing sergeant's stripes stood silhouetted against the fluorescent light. His demeanor was different, less aggressive, more analytical. He carried a clipboard, and his eyes, though initially guarded, held a flicker of something resembling curiosity as they landed on Nadine. He approached her cell, his footsteps echoing softly in the silence. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Miller," he stated, his voice deeper than the others, and refreshingly, without the dismissive undertone Nadine had grown accustomed to. "We're just trying to get some clarity on your identification. There's been some discrepancy." "I told the officers who I am, Sergeant," Nadine responded, her voice steady, though a faint hope, a professional courtesy, stirred within her. "I am Judge Nadine Russell, of the state court. My credentials should be easily verifiable." She met his gaze directly, allowing the full weight of her identity and her profession to rest in her eyes. He nodded slowly, his gaze still assessing. He took her ID, which had been removed during booking, and studied it intently. Nadine watched his face, a canvas of subtle changes. His eyebrows, initially furrowed with mild skepticism, gradually relaxed. A faint line appeared between them as he seemed to put pieces together. His lips, previously a thin line, softened almost imperceptibly. He looked up from the card, then back to Nadine's face, a new expression dawning in his eyes, a flicker of dawning realization, then a distinct widening of recognition. The casual dismissiveness that had clung to the other officers was absent from his face now, replaced by something akin to shock, then palpable concern. The wall of their ignorance, Nadine realized, had just begun to crack. Sergeant Miller's sudden shift in demeanor was a ripple that quickly spread through the quiet precinct. He turned abruptly from Nadine's cell, his voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur as he spoke into his radio. Nadine watched him, a sentinel of quiet observation. The younger deputies, who had maintained their casual indifference just moments before, now exchanged anxious glances, their previous arrogance visibly deflating. The atmosphere thickened with an unspoken panic, the palpable realization of a colossal error dawning on them. The sergeant barked orders into his radio, his gaze occasionally darting back to Nadine, a mixture of disbelief and burgeoning alarm in his eyes. He then began pacing, pulling out his phone, making quick, hushed calls. Nadine could infer the frantic attempts to verify, to confirm the inconvenient truth she had stated from the very beginning. Her impeccable record, her active status as a state judge, details they had so casually dismissed as the ramblings of an arrestee, now became undeniable, irrefutable facts, reverberating through the small station. Finally, the sergeant returned to Nadine's cell, his face a mask of profound chagrin. He unlocked the door himself, the click of the mechanism a sharp contrast to the previous brutal clang of the cuffs. "Judge Russell," he began, his voice now laced with a heavy dose of respect, almost deference, "my sincerest apologies. There's been a grave misunderstanding, a terrible mistake." The apologies that followed were clumsy, thick with embarrassment rather than genuine remorse. The deputies who had arrested her appeared at his side, their faces pale, their previous smirks replaced by expressions of shock and unease. They muttered their own apologies, avoiding Nadine's gaze, their words hollow. She listened impassively, observing their discomfort. It wasn't about her, not truly. It was about their own careers, their own egregious misjudgment now laid bare. They offered to drive her back to her car to ensure she was taken care of. Nadine accepted, her dignity unyielding, even as the cuffs were finally removed, the lingering marks on her wrists a phantom reminder of the indignity. As she walked out of the precinct, the afternoon sun felt different, less indifferent, more like a spotlight. She was released, yes, but the story, she instinctively knew, had only just begun. The profound blunder, the truth of her identity, was already rippling outwards, ready to break through the surface of their quiet rural precinct. Nadine was home, the quiet solace of her living room a stark contrast to the sterile holding cell. Yet a profound unease still clung to her. The phantom pressure of the handcuffs remained on her wrists, a constant reminder of the gross injustice. She had barely begun to process the surreal events of her unlawful arrest when the outside world began to explode. It started subtly, a notification on her phone, then another, a rapid succession of alerts signaling an unusual digital tremor. A text from a colleague, then a call from a reporter she knew. And then she saw it, a raw, unedited video, shaky and brief, but devastatingly clear. It showed the very moment the deputies, faces grim and unyielding, placed cuffs on her wrists at the rest stop. The injustice was captured in stark, undeniable pixels. The video, uploaded by an anonymous bystander, went viral with terrifying speed. It was a digital firestorm. News channels picked it up, social media erupted in a cacophony of outrage and disbelief. Judge Nadine Russell, her name, her face, now synonymous with the phrase racial profiling. The contrast was too stark, too infuriating for the public to ignore. A respected black state judge, impeccable and composed, being treated like a common criminal by officers sworn to uphold the law. The incident ignited a furious debate, a public indictment of systemic issues that Nadine had long discussed in conferences, now laid bare for the world to see through her own lived experience. Hashtags trended. Comment sections overflowed with a mix of fury, solidarity, and personal anecdotes echoing similar encounters. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Her personal ordeal had become a symbol, a lightning rod for national outrage and calls for accountability. Nadine watched the storm, a strange detachment settling over her. It was painful, humiliating in its public display, yet undeniably powerful. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was the story. It was the collective scream of countless others who had endured similar injustices without a camera, without a title to elevate their cries. She had been released, yes, but the video ensured that the true story of what happened at that rest stop and what it represented was far from over. The quiet dignity she maintained during the arrest now radiated across millions of screens, amplifying the profound injustice and demanding a reckoning. The morning after the viral explosion dawned with a frantic energy that permeated every news cycle. Nadine Russell's name, once confined to judicial circles, was now a national headline emblazoned across every screen. The public outcry had reached a crescendo, demanding immediate action. Whispers of investigations and disciplinary actions against the deputies had begun to circulate, but the scale of the outrage suggested something far more profound was underway. Nadine sat in her study, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, when the call came. It was the Chief Justice's chambers, the voice on the other end, grave but urgent. An emergency judicial misconduct hearing had been swiftly convened for the deputies involved in her arrest. The speed was unprecedented, a direct response to the national pressure. Then the stunning news. She was being appointed to preside over it. The words hung in the air, potent and almost surreal. The very individuals who had subjected Nadine to racial profiling, who had unlawfully arrested her, would now stand before her bench. It was a twist of fate so profound, so utterly unexpected, that for a fleeting moment, even her disciplined mind struggled to grasp its full implications. This wasn't just justice, it was an almost cosmic alignment, a stark and immediate reversal of power. Nadine closed her eyes, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. The instinct for personal vengeance, fleeting as it was immediately eclipsed by the immense weight of her professional duty. She was a judge. Her role was to apply the law fairly, impartially, even when the accused had wronged her directly. This was an opportunity, not for retribution, but for the impartial application of justice against the misuse of power. It was a chance to embody the very principles of fairness and accountability she had championed her entire career. She accepted with a quiet, unwavering resolve. There was no hesitation, no outward show of emotion. Only the deep, resonant understanding of the immense responsibility now placed upon her shoulders. Her presence on that bench would be a powerful symbol, a testament to the enduring strength of those who fight for justice, and a chilling reminder to those who abuse authority. The courtroom awaited not just a stage for legal proceedings, but a crucible where the raw indignity she endured would be transformed through the meticulous process of law into a demand for accountability. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. It was Nadine's courtroom, the familiar scent of old paper and polished wood, a comforting anchor, yet the air crackled with an almost unbearable tension. Every seat was filled, not just by legal professionals, but by media, civil rights advocates, and a public hungry for justice. She walked to the bench, robes flowing, head held high, her steps measured and deliberate. The gavel, cold and heavy in her hand, felt like an extension of her own resolve. Her gaze swept across the room, settling for a moment on the two deputies who stood before her. Their faces, once arrogant and dismissive, were now pale, etched with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and a dawning understanding of the gravity of their situation. The younger officer, his eyes darting nervously, couldn't meet her gaze. His partner, the taller one who had placed the cuffs on her, stared straight ahead, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Nadine acknowledged their presence with a solemn, impartial nod, then settled into her chair. "This is an emergency hearing regarding alleged misconduct." Her voice resonated through the hushed room, clear and authoritative, devoid of any personal inflection. "The proceedings will adhere strictly to protocol. Emotions will not dictate the outcome. Only facts, evidence, and the law will prevail." She set the parameters, a clear boundary against the raw public sentiment that hung in the air. The testimony began. Nadine listened meticulously as the bystanders' video was played, its raw footage a damning indictment. She heard the statements from the responding sergeant, his tone now apologetic, revealing the frantic internal calls that had followed the discovery of her identity. She posed questions, incisive and precise, dissecting the sequence of events, probing the lack of probable cause, the blatant disregard for protocol. Each question was a surgical strike, exposing the factual breaches and the chilling undercurrents of racial bias that had underpinned their actions. The weight of the moment was immense. Not just the burden of this specific case, but the collective weight of years. Years of similar stories she had heard from countless victims. Years of fighting for justice in a system that often resisted. She felt the quiet pressure of history, the silent presence of all those who had been wronged without recourse. Yet her resolve remained unyielding. This was not a personal vendetta. It was the solemn duty of a judge, transforming personal indignity into a demand for systemic accountability. The courtroom was a crucible, and truth, however uncomfortable, was slowly, meticulously being forged. The hearing stretched into the afternoon, each testimony, each piece of evidence, weaving a clearer picture of the deputies' blatant disregard for protocol and their shocking abuse of authority. Nadine listened intently, her expression unreadable, allowing every word to be spoken, every document to be presented. The defense lawyers, clearly on the back foot, struggled to explain away the undeniable facts laid before the court. Finally, the arguments concluded. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on Nadine. She paused, a deliberate beat of stillness, before delivering her findings. Based on the evidence presented, her voice resonated with an unshakable authority. The court finds that Deputy Miller and Deputy Jenkins engaged in multiple violations of department protocol and constitutional rights. She detailed each point with precise legal clarity. There was no verifiable probable cause for the initial stop. The vehicle description claimed was found to be erroneous. The demand for an unconsented search was unlawful. And the subsequent arrest for obstruction, given Judge Russell's calm assertion of rights, was an egregious misapplication of the law and an abuse of power. Nadine did not raise her voice, nor did she allow a single tremor of personal emotion to enter her tone. This was a verdict, not a sermon. The deputies standing before her seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. Their faces, once defiant, now registered a mixture of dread and profound shame. The audience remained hushed, hanging on every word, recognizing the monumental significance of this moment. Nadine was not seeking vengeance. She was meticulously applying the law they had sworn to uphold. Accordingly, Nadine continued, her gaze steady on the two men, Deputy Miller and Deputy Jenkins are hereby suspended without pay, pending a full internal investigation by the department's Professional Standards Unit and potential criminal charges. This court also recommends a thorough review of their training and the implicit bias within their unit. The gavel came down, a sharp, resonant crack that echoed through the room. It was not a sound of triumph, but of finality, of a principle affirmed. The courtroom exhaled, a collective, silent sigh of relief and solemn satisfaction. Justice, however incremental, had been served. It was a victory not just for Nadine Russell, but for the countless others whose voices had been silenced, whose dignity had been trampled, whose rights had been ignored. The path forward was still long, but for today the balance had shifted, however slightly, towards accountability. The gavel's final echo in the courtroom was just the beginning. The story of Judge Nadine Russell's arrest and her subsequent presiding over the deputy's hearing exploded anew across national headlines, cementing its place as a pivotal moment. The raw footage, combined with her dignified, uncompromising verdict, became a potent symbol. It was undeniable proof of systemic issues, forcing a conversation that many in power had long tried to avoid. Within hours of the hearing's conclusion, the governor's office issued a press release. Under immense public pressure and acknowledging the undeniable evidence presented in Nadine's case, sweeping new initiatives were announced. Mandatory bias training would be implemented statewide for all law enforcement agencies, going beyond simple diversity modules to include implicit bias recognition and de-escalation techniques rooted in respect for civilian rights. Independent oversight committees would be established in key counties to review citizen complaints and police conduct. Nadine's case, once a personal indignity, had transformed into the blueprint for policy reform. Nadine watched the news reports from her study, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. It wasn't full victory, not yet. Systemic change was a marathon, not a sprint. But these were concrete steps, born directly from the undeniable truth exposed during her ordeal. The public outrage, channeled through social media and ethical journalism, had forced the hands of power, demonstrating the profound ripple effect of individual experience meeting collective voice. Calls from colleagues, civil rights leaders, and even some law enforcement officials who genuinely sought change poured in. They expressed solidarity, offered support, and most importantly, discussed strategies for sustained reform. Nadine lent her voice, her experience, and her expertise, not with a sense of personal grievance, but with the quiet authority of someone who had lived the problem and now sought to be part of the solution. The governor's press conference, a week later, prominently featured her story as the catalyst for these unprecedented reforms. Nadine was not there to gloat, but her silent presence, amplified by the news cameras, underscored the gravity of the commitments being made. Her quiet strength had turned a moment of profound personal indignity into a powerful, undeniable argument for a more just and equitable application of the law. The path towards true justice was long and arduous, but thanks to her unwavering resolve, the journey for Georgia, and perhaps beyond, had taken a crucial, undeniable step forward. Months later, the echoes of Nadine's arrest had subsided from the daily headlines, but their impact resonated deeply in the corridors of power and in the hearts of a new generation. She found herself standing at a podium, not in a courtroom, but in a large auditorium, the air filled with the eager anticipation of graduates. Before her sat hundreds of fresh faces, new police cadets, their uniforms crisp, their eyes shining with idealism. This was the first graduating class of the Reformed Police Training Program, a direct outcome of the statewide initiatives sparked by her very public ordeal. Nadine's speech was not a lecture on law, nor a retelling of grievance. It was a deeply personal address delivered with the quiet authority that had become her hallmark. She spoke of the day at the rest stop, not with bitterness, but as a stark illustration of the consequences when trust is broken, when dignity is denied. She spoke of Officer Miller and Officer Jenkins, not with vengeance, but as a cautionary tale of how implicit biases can erode the very foundation of justice. "You are about to wear a shield," Nadine told them, her voice clear, resonating with a lifetime of legal experience. That shield carries immense power, and with it, a sacred trust. The true dignity of your service lies not in your authority over others, but in your ability to see the humanity in every single person you encounter. It's in your capacity for empathy, your unwavering commitment to procedure, and your courage to uphold the law impartially, regardless of who stands before you. Nadine emphasized accountability, not just for the public, but within their own ranks. She spoke of the subtle biases they would need to confront within themselves, the constant vigilance required to ensure justice was blind, not to race, but to its true principles. She recounted how her own unwavering composure, the very act of asserting her rights, had, ironically, allowed the truth of their injustice to be seen. As she concluded, the cadets rose to their feet, not in a polite ovation, but in a genuine outpouring of respect and inspiration. Their faces, once filled only with youthful ambition, now bore a deeper understanding, a solemn acceptance of the profound responsibility they were inheriting. Nadine had transformed her pain into purpose, her indignity into a powerful lesson. The path ahead for true reform remained long and arduous, but as she looked out at those young, hopeful faces, she knew that the seeds of a more just and equitable future had been planted, and her own unwavering strength had helped to sow them. The memoir of her personal struggle had become a guidepost, illuminating the path for a new generation.